Håfa Day students, I am Governor Lou Leon Guerrero. Welcome to PBS University. Our friends at PBS Guam and the Guam Department of Education put this episode together with some fun and exciting learning material to help you keep up with your studies. So thank you for joining us on another learning adventure. Sidzu Masi and have a great lesson.
Håfa Day, and welcome to this series about archaeology and ancient sites of the Mariana Islands. These episodes introduce the most current facts and findings from archaeological sites toward clarifying what we know versus what we do not know about how people lived in the islands throughout the last thousands of years. This knowledge can support diverse new discussions, perspectives, and interpretations. I hope that you like this series, and I look forward to learning more together.
Ancient DNA obtained directly from ancient archaeological sites can reveal amazing details about the people who lived in the past. I asked genomics analyst Mark Stoneking if he please could share about his research with his team looking into the ancient DNA of the people who lived long ago in Guam of the Mariana Islands.
I want to start by acknowledging the people who actually did the work I'm going to tell you about. Arina Pugash, who was a postdoc in my group then, Alex Hubner, also a postdoc, and Matthias Meyer, who is sort of our ancient DNA guru. And so this was work done when I was a group leader at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. This work has been published. Guam is part of the, as you know, a part of the Mariana Islands, which is this archipelago of about 15 islands spread across about 750 kilometers of ocean in the Pacific. It is quite distant from the nearest major land masses, so about 2,500 kilometers east of the Philippines, about 2,200 kilometers north of New Guinea. It was first settled, based on archaeological evidence, at least 3,600 to 3,800 years ago, possibly even earlier. And that's actually slightly before the colonization of Polynesia. So even though we know quite a bit about the colonization of Polynesia, about all these remote islands in the Pacific, Hawaii, Easter Island, New Zealand, and so forth, we know very little about the history of the colonization of the Mariana Islands, even though it's really a tremendous feat that humans accomplished. It's really amazing. People had to cross then over 2,000 kilometers of open ocean. And while voyages of similar length occurred during the colonization of Polynesia, those very long open ocean voyages in Polynesia didn't occur until more than 2,000 years later, until only about 1,000 years ago or so. So these people, it was just amazing. To put in the words of Bill Howells, a biological anthropologist, from a book he wrote about 50 years ago, many books have been written about where the Polynesians came from, but nobody cares a straw about where the Guamanians came from. And yet it's probable they can tell us at least as much about the peopling of the Pacific as can the Polynesians. The first question that we wanted to address in this study is, where did they come from? There are a number of different lines of evidence that have been used to address this question. From linguistics, it seems to suggest a connection to the Philippines and Indonesia. So the languages in the Pacific all fall within this one large family called the Austronesian family, which had its origins in Taiwan and then spread down through the Philippines, through Indonesia, on out through island Oceania and into the rest of the Pacific. Austronesian language family has several different sub-branches. One of these is Western Malayo-Polynesian. So these are the languages, as you can see here, the Philippines and of Western Indonesia. Then there's the Central Malayo-Polynesian branch shown here in green. These are sort of Eastern Indonesia. The South Halmahera West New Guinea branch shown here in yellow. And then Oceanic encompasses basically all of the languages of Polynesia, Micronesia, remote Oceania, except for the Mariana Islands and some nearby islands like Palau. The Mariana Islands, the language spoken there are Western Malayo-Polynesian languages, like the languages in the Philippines and Indonesia. So the languages suggest a connection that way. In terms of the archaeology, the pottery that one finds in the Marianas has been associated by some archaeologists with a type of pottery that is also known in the Philippines from slightly earlier, about 4,000 years ago, and can possibly also be related to lapita pottery, which is a type of special pottery that's associated with the initial colonization of Polynesia. It's at about 3,300 years ago. So the archaeology, at least to some archaeologists, also suggests a trail coming from the Philippines. But computer simulations of voyaging suggest a different origin. So even though linguistics and archaeology would suggest the red arrows here coming from the Philippines or perhaps Indonesia, computer simulations of voyaging that try to take into account variation of the winds, the currents, and so forth never show successful colonization from this area. Instead, the only successful colonization events arise from eastern Indonesia, main island of New Guinea, or the Bismarck Archipelago, the islands of New Britain and New Ireland off the coast of New Guinea. One way that we can try to distinguish between these sort of competing hypotheses about the source is to use DNA studies. There's a strong difference in the DNA ancestry of populations to the west of Wallace's line. So these would be the populations of Western Indonesia and mainland Southeast Asia, and populations to the east of Wallace's line, those in Wallacea, Eastern Indonesia, and then on out into the Pacific. Modern populations examined to date from east of Wallace's line have appreciable amounts of what we call Papuan ancestry. This is ancestry related to the main island of New Guinea. And so I'll refer to that throughout this as Papuan-related ancestry. And so you can see from the red pie charts, the highest amount of this ancestry we do see in New Guinea, especially in the highlands of New Guinea. But we see it on all of these islands here in eastern Indonesia, as well as in the Polynesian islands. But you go to the west of Wallace's line, and it's a really striking boundary in the ancestry that we do not see any of this Papuan-related ancestry anywhere in Western Indonesia or in the Philippines. That then indicates that DNA studies can help shed light on the origins of the people from the Mariana Islands. So if we were to conduct DNA analyses and we find no Papuan ancestry, that would be consistent with origins from the Philippines or Western Indonesia. But if we do find some Papuan ancestry, then that would be consistent with origins from Eastern Indonesia or New Guinea or the Bismarck Archipelago. In principle, we could do this study with the modern-day inhabitants of the Mariana Islanders. But the ancestry of the modern Mariana Islanders, the people who are there today, may not actually reflect the original settlement because of subsequent events. And we know there have been subsequent events since the initial colonization. As is well known, there is this latte period that's identified archaeologically that starts about 1,200 years ago and lasts until about 300 years ago or so. And there are substantial cultural changes that are reflected in the archaeology of this period. These massive stone pillars, which are called latte, and which were used as supports for these large communal houses. Then you have the period of European contact, beginning with Ferdinand Magellan in 1521. Subsequent contact with Europeans led to large-scale population relocations in the Marianas, reductions in population size. You have the Manila Acapulco galleons, which were voyages that went every year between Manila and the Philippines and Acapulco in Mexico. So there are all of these other subsequent events after initial colonization that could be impacting the ancestry in the modern Mariana Islanders. So it would be more desirable to do this sort of analysis, not with modern populations, but with ancient populations that would be closer in time to the initial colonization. And so we were fortunate a few years ago to be contacted by two archaeologists, Mike Carson and Sao Shin Hong, who had been working in a site called Ritidian Beach Cave in the northern part of Guam. And during their excavations, they uncovered partial skeletal remains of two individuals. So these are called RBC1 and RBC2. And one of these was directly radiocarbon dated to be about 2,200 years old. And so this is not at the time of the initial colonization, of course, but it is certainly much closer in time to the initial colonization than modern Mariana Islanders would be. And more importantly, this predates the latte period by roughly 1,000 years or so. So hopefully it's in a time period where most of the ancestry of the people then would probably reflect the initial colonization. We only have data from two individuals, and these two individuals could be related. We tried to investigate that question, but we didn't have enough data to be able to tell for sure whether or not they were related. So it may very well be that if we got data from more individuals, we would have a different picture than what I'm going to tell you now. The picture that we have is based on the data that we have. Okay, the first thing that we looked at were what are called the uniparental markers. So these are special types of DNA that are transmitted transmitted only by one parent. One of these is mitochondrial DNA, which is found in the structures called mitochondria outside the nuclei of cells, and mitochondria is involved in energy production. And it turns out that mitochondrial DNA is transmitted only from mothers to sons and daughters. So both men and women have mitochondrial DNA, but only women transmit it to their offspring. So when we study variation in mitochondrial DNA, we're learning about what the women were doing. And then we also have this small chromosome here. This is a human Y chromosome compared to the X chromosome. The Y chromosome is transmitted from fathers to sons. So by studying variation in the Y chromosome, we learn about the paternal history of human populations. When we look at the mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome types or lineages that we found in these two individuals, RBC1 and RBC2 had identical mitochondrial DNA lineages, and they both were a type that we call E2A. The names aren't important. What's important is that this particular lineage today is found at highest frequency in Guam. It accounts for about 60% of the mitochondrial DNA lineages in Guam today. Otherwise, it is found only in the Philippines and Indonesia. So this result provides a strong link of continuity between what we found in these ancient skeletons and the people today. And it also strongly suggests an origin coming from either the Philippines or Indonesia. One of these two individuals turned out to be male, RBC1, and so therefore we could look at the Y chromosome of RBC1. And his Y chromosome lineage is one that is very widespread across Southeast Asia and Oceania. So it's not very informative about origins, but it is one that has been associated with the expansion of Austronesian-speaking peoples. But what's more informative is to look not just at the mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome, but variation across all of the chromosomes, what's called a karyotype, a picture of the 23 pairs of chromosomes that humans have. And thanks to advances in next generation sequencing technologies, from the very tiny amounts of ancient DNA that we were able to recover from these skeletons, we could look at lots and lots of variable positions in the genomes of these two individuals. So almost 129,000 positions in RBC1 and 360 or so thousand positions on RBC2. And this then gives us quite a bit of insights into the genome-wide variation in these two individuals. And so what we do then is compare that to the variation that we see in the modern populations today from the region, as well as to ancient specimens that have already been analyzed, and try to get some insights into the ancestry of these two individuals. So one of the first analyses that we do is called PCA, which stands for Principal Components Analysis. The data that we actually have, if you can think of a table, we would have two rows in this table, one for RBC1 and one for RBC2. And for RBC1, we would have 128,772 columns. And for RBC2, we would have even more columns. As you can imagine, trying to stare at that sort of a table and make any sense out of it, and it's not anything that us humans can do. So we need ways to pick out what's the most important information in terms of the variation in those individuals, especially when we compare them to hundreds of individuals from all across the region. And so with PCA, what it does is it extracts the most important source of variation in the data and assigns a number to that, to each individual. Each of these points here represents a single individual with their values in the first principal component shown here on the horizontal axis. And then once you've accounted for the most variation with the first principal component, the second principal component accounts for the next most important source of variation. And so these two together make up the most important sources of variation in the data. Individuals who plot close to each other are going to be more closely related genetically than individuals who plot further apart. And so what we see here is that we have a lot of Southeast Asian populations, Taiwan, Indonesia, the Philippines, all in this part of the plot. We have New Guinea up here. We have sort of a scatter of individuals coming from island Oceania, the Bismarck Archipelago, Vanuatu, Bougainville, Solomon Islands, Micronesia, Polynesia. So these all have variable amounts of Asian-related ancestry and New Guinea or Papuan-related ancestry. And then we also have some data from some very early Lapidus skeletons. These are coming from Vanuatu and Tonga. So they're similar to the East Asians, but also shifted off of them. And so we plot all of these individuals, and then we can ask, where do the ancient Guam samples plot? And it turns out they plot right here. So these are the ancient Guam samples, and they are in this end of the plot. And these are all individuals who have no discernible Papuan ancestry. So they're close to the Philippines and Indonesia and Southeast Asia, far from New Guinea, no indication of any New Guinea-related ancestry. Another type of analysis that we can do is called admixture analysis, because it looks for variation coming from multiple sources. we assume a model where several different ancestral populations contributed ancestry to the individuals that we are studying. This is done on an individual level. And I should emphasize that's also the case here. All of these, the data that went into this were individuals with no information about what population they were from. It's only after we plot the points here in the PC space, then we assign them to the populations that they came from, and then we see how they group together. So the fact that these individuals all group together up here, for example, is not because we told the program they were all from New Guinea. The program didn't know that. It just simply says these individuals all are very similar. And then we go back later and we say, aha, these individuals are all from New Guinea. Same thing here. What you can't see is that each of these blocks consists of individual columns where each column is an individual. We've assigned ancestry to each individual, assuming a certain number of ancestral populations, and we color each ancestral population by a different color to indicate the different sources. And then the program assigns to each individual how much ancestry comes from each of the ancestral populations. The important point that you should get from this is that when we do this analysis, we see that New Guinea has almost its own ancestry. Almost all the people from New Guinea all have just this yellow component. And we see this yellow component also in the Bismarck Archipelago, in Vanuatu. These are all modern samples. So all of the populations that I showed you before where we said there was Papuan ancestry, they all have some of this yellow component. If we go now to the ancient samples, we see, for example, ancient Vanuatu over here, they also have some of the yellow component. So it's well known they have some Papuan-related ancestry. But if we look at the ancient Guam individuals, and they're enlarged here to make it easier to see. So you see the two individuals here as two columns. Again, we don't see any of this yellow component. There is no Papuan-related ancestry here. Instead, what they have are large amounts of this orange component, which is associated with the ancient Polynesians. These are the Lapita samples. And they have this blue component, which is associated with Southeast Asia, as well as a little bit of some other components. But the crucial thing here is, again, we see no evidence of any Papuan-related ancestry here. These are sort of descriptive analyses that we can do. We can also try to test this more formally with a statistical model. We use what is called an F4 statistic. Basically, the F4 statistic tests whether a hypothetical branching relationship for four groups is consistent with the data or not. So here's our hypothetical relationship here. We have an outgroup. These would be, say, Africans, for example. And then we compare Papuans from New Guinea, our ancient Guam samples, and an Asian population, a Southeast Asian population. And what the F4 statistic tests is this tree a good representation of the data? You compare the correlation in gene frequency estimates between ancient Guam and Asia and Papuan and the outgroup. And when you compare ancient Guam to Asia, you're looking at this part of the tree. So differences between ancient Guam and the Asian population would have arisen since these two last shared a common ancestor here. So we're looking at variation in the red part of the tree here. In this part of the statistic, we're comparing variation in this part of the tree between the Papuan population and our African outgroup population. And that's the blue part of the tree. And the crucial thing that I hope you can see is that there is no overlap. So that means that changes that are occurring in this part of the tree during the history of these groups is completely independent of changes occurring in the red part of the tree. If we calculate the correlation between these two, since there's no correlation there, if the tree is correct, we should get a value for the statistic that is 0. If the tree is wrong, if there is some Papuan ancestry in the ancient Guam samples, for example, we will get an F4 statistic that is bigger than 0, significantly bigger than 0. And conversely, if there is more Papuan ancestry in the Asian population, then we will get an F4 statistic, which is less than 0. And so what I've done here is plot for this F4 statistic here, where test is different populations from Oceania, Kankanea group from the Philippines, so that's our Asian source, New Guinea Highlands, and Mabuti Pygmies as the African outgroup. And you can't see the labels here, but these are all populations from across Oceania, which we all think have both Papuan and Asian-related ancestry. And these are values of the F4 statistic. The red points indicate values which are significantly different from 0. And as you can see, all of these populations here have F4 values significantly different from 0, meaning they all have Papuan-related ancestry, except for the ancient Guam samples. The ancient Guam samples have an F4 statistic, which is not significant significantly different from 0. And so again, by this test, there is no Papuan ancestry in the ancient Guam samples. So what we would conclude from these analyses is that there is no Papuan ancestry in the ancient Guam samples, and all results suggest strong affinities between ancient Guam and the Philippines and Taiwan as potential sources. So that means we sort of need to rethink these computer simulations of voyaging, which said that it was impossible to get from the Philippines to Guam. Apparently, people did manage to do the impossible there. What's also intriguing in these analyses is that and not something that we necessarily expected, is that we see strong affinities between the ancient samples from Guam and the earliest samples coming from Polynesia, from remote Oceania, Vanuatu, and Tonga. And so to explore these in more detail, we analyzed what are called admixture graphs. So admixture graphs can be basically thought of as a tree which shows population splitting events. Like I showed you in the F4 statistic, that was a tree indicating population splits. But in the admixture graph, we know that there's more than just population splits that went on in human history. We know there's also been migration and contact between populations. And so admixture graphs allow for migration. So they infer both the history of population divergence events and the history of migration events in a set of populations. And so this is what we get when we do the admixture history graph for ancient Guam. And it looks quite complicated, and that's because it is. So I'm not going to try to walk you through all of this. But basically what we have here is we have comparative populations which provide us with sources of Papuan ancestry and early Austronesian ancestry, as well as potentially other sources of ancestry that might have contributed. And so we see here from the early Austronesian ancestry, we see the Kankanai from the Philippines branching off. And crucially, what we see here is that there is some shared ancestry. The fact that we see a solid arrow, which is divergence, the dotted arrows are migration events between Guam and the ancient samples from Tonga and Vanuatu, the Lapita samples. That does indicate that there is some shared ancestry there. So it's not just overall similarity, but they do actually share ancestry, okay, between Guam, Lapita Tonga, and Lapita Vanuatu. And that's quite interesting. So the ancient DNA shows this shared ancestry. It suggests then that Guam and Polynesia were colonized from the same source population. So even though their archaeology is different, even though their languages are different, it was the same source population that colonized both Guam and led to the Lapita sources. And it also suggests that the Marianas may have played a role in the further settlement of the Pacific. Now, I emphasize that this is very speculative. Our results by no means prove that this was the case, but they don't disprove it either. It exists as a possible explanation. So let me show you exactly what I mean here. So here we have the area that we're talking about. And the blue arrow here shows sort of the conventional view of how Polynesia was colonized. That began with the migration of Austronesian-speaking peoples out of Taiwan, perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. They come down through the Philippines. They island hop their way across Indonesia, along the coast of New Guinea and the islands offshore of New Guinea. They reached the Bismarck Archipelago. That was probably a major staging area for further voyages. And then they go on out into the rest of the Pacific, Vanuatu, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, and then the more remote islands. So that's sort of the conventional view of how Polynesia was colonized. But now we know we had this separate migration that came out to the Mariana Islands, actually earlier than the migration to Polynesia, coming from at least the same source population, that much we can say. And the possibility exists. Now, again, let me emphasize, this is just a possibility, but the possibility exists that when people didn't just stop there when they got to the Marianas, maybe they continued on, and maybe they contributed ancestry to the populations that went on to settle Polynesia. Again, speculative, but I want to end with some words from Bill Howells again, who in his book wrote the following. What about a Micronesian route for the colonization of Polynesia? It's not in favor with the anthropologists, though after all, it was not anthropologists who settled Polynesia. So I think it's just something to keep in mind, to keep alive as a potential possibility here, that people from the Marianas, their ancestors, may have gone on to contribute to the settlement of the rest of the Pacific as well. So that's it. Thank you for listening to me, and I hope that was reasonably clear.
Thank you for joining us in learning about archaeology and ancient sites of the Mariana Islands. If you would like to access more details, then I encourage you to visit in person or online at the Micronesian Area Research Center of the University of Guam, or at the many other libraries, museums, and offices that work with historic preservation, archaeology, and ancient history. Thank you again for watching this program. I hope that you will continue to explore and discover more.
I'm Josh Tenorio, your Lieutenant Governor. Thank you for being with us today and for taking the time to continue your learning with PBS University. I also want to thank your teachers and support staff at DOE and PBS Guam for their work and their commitment to you, our students. Si Dus Ma'asi, and we hope that you enjoy this PBS University instruction.